I realized that. So what did I need to overcome? Number one, I think God was so great when he said, don't want to be like anybody else. It's who I've called you to be.
As of 2021, there were a total of 10,527 Assemblies of God lead pastors in our fellowship. But of those, just over 650 in the entire nation are women. It's hard to follow your calling if you've never seen it modeled before. So today we talk to a well-known, bilingual, female lead pastor and multiple church planter. So tag a friend, invite her into this conversation, and let's get started. Welcome to the Women of SoCal Leadership podcast. My name is Nicky Stade, and I'm the Executive Director at Women of SoCal. And today I am joined by my friend, co-host, and Director of Mujeres de SoCal, Miriam Saravia. How are you doing today, Miriam?
I'm doing really, really good. Thank you, Nicky. And it's how exciting to be here with you today. And thank you for bringing me on today.
Yeah, it's such an honor to do ministry alongside of you and just to see what the Lord is doing in our Spanish churches throughout SoCal Network. And so I'm just so glad that you're here. And I know that today we have a very special guest that we have invited onto this podcast. So can you just tell us a little bit about who she is and what inspired you to invite her to this interview?
Wow. She is a wonderful, wonderful young woman of God who has just inspired me throughout the years. You know, I've known her for a while, and her name is Adelita Garza. She is the founder and a lead pastor of both the Spanish and English congregation at Puente de Vida, Bridge of Life. It's the church in Santa Paula, and Adelita and her team launched Mission Puente, which is a daughter church in Mexico and in Michoacan, Mexico. And wow, I mean, we're going to find out so many things about her, and I know you will be inspired the way I have been also inspired. And also Adelita is passionate about seeing the lost come to Jesus and working toward the unity of the church. She received her BA in church leadership at Bethany College and also her MD in divine theology in Fuller. So so I'm excited. I'm excited to hear and get to know her even more. So we're going to discover a lot about her today, and I know that she will be an inspiration to many other young girls and many young ladies and women in general who are inspiring and aspire to be in ministry one day.
That is awesome. Well, let's bring her on, and please welcome our guest today, Adelita Garza. How are you today?
I am doing great. I've got to say that the first thing I love, Miriam, that you said is she's a young woman. That was my favorite part of everything you said. So I thank you, Miriam. I'll pay you later.
I love that. That is so awesome. I know every month I get my hair color subscription in the mail and I think, oh, I have to do it again, but it's worth it.
Yes. Yeah. A little white here and there, that's all right.
Yeah. But we cover our secrets well, right? Well, yes. Adelita, it is such a joy to have you on the podcast today. And, some of the best stories start with in the beginning. So let's start with your origin story. When did you first have an encounter with God, and what led you to know that you were even called into ministry?
Wow. I probably have to go back to my first real experience with Jesus. I would say it was my salvation moment at the age of 8. And I was 8 years old, and I was a second grader in elementary school, and they told me I needed to wear eyeglasses. And I didn't want to. I absolutely didn't want to. I remember I went to my mother and I said, Mom, I do not want to wear glasses. And she said, Mija, which is my little girl, she said, Mija, this is something you have to do. And I said, I don't want to. And she said, well, you can pray. And I said, okay, I will pray. And she said, you pray, and then we'll take you to the optometrist and we'll see what happens. And so I prayed as a little girl, an 8-year-old, full of faith. I prayed, and I remember the day that my mom takes me to the optometrist office, and I stand right in front of that optometrist, and I said, I don't need glasses. And he said, yes, you do. And so my mom says, will you check her eyes again? She is convinced that she doesn't need them. Long story short, y'all, he checked my eyes. I walked out of that place with no glasses. And to this day, I turned 50 years old this year. I know women don't normally say their age, but I'm okay saying mine. I turned 50 years old and I still go to my eye doctor and I have 20/20 vision. I mean, from that moment, God just healed me. And so that was my salvation experience. So as a child, even just then saying, God, you're a God of power. You're able to do great things. And so that I would probably say that was my first experience as a child to know God is real. God is real. And I was 15 years old. I was given a diagnosis of having scoliosis. And it was severe enough that I had to wear a brace. I was told I had to wear a brace for 1 year. And I was that middle school actually I was in high school at that point. I was a high school student who I didn't want to be walking around campus with a brace on. I didn't want to be made fun of. I didn't want to be pointed at. And I remember at that time I had two siblings of mine who they owned an athletic club, and I had walked to that athletic club and I was sitting in a corner depressed because I had just heard this news. And an evangelist walks in. He was actually a, a bodybuilder. He's a huge guy, and he walked in and he asked me, "So why are you so depressed?" And I said, I don't want to wear a brace. And so I shared my story with him, and he said, "Do you think God can heal you?" And I said, "Yeah, I think he can." And he sat me down. He took me into an office and he sat me down on the floor. And because of my scoliosis, I had one hip that was higher than the other, which when I sat down and I put them side by side, I had one leg that was shorter than the other. You could see that. And as he prayed for me, I saw it with my eyes. My leg grew. My leg grew. I got up from that moment of having been prayed for. My back was straight. I never wore a brace, not at all. I was healed. And so just healing experiences for me have been just a God presence. Like God is real. I know he is. And so at the age of 16, going to a youth camp and feeling this call from God in my life, at that point, I just knew God was real. And I was willing to take that step and say, okay, God, let's do this. So I was 16 years old at a youth camp and God spoke. And I said, yes. And so here I am several years later, still fulfilling a call that God has placed on my life.
That is awesome. Did you know right away that you were called to be a lead pastor?
Oh no. Oh, I would have ran from the call. I would have said, no, I'm out of here. Sorry, God. You picked the wrong one. I would have been like Moses, pick somebody else. And I would have pointed at an Aaron in my life. But no, I didn't. As a matter of fact, I really thought I was going to be a traveling evangelist. And even that didn't make sense to me because I was very timid and maybe we can talk about that later. But so no, I did not. I would have never envisioned it, but I think that's the way ministry works. As God shapes us, as God molds us, as God speaks to us, as we learn, as we fall, as we get up, and he continues to just position us where he wants us in different seasons of our lives. So no, I would have ran. I would have been Jonah too. I would have said, no, I'm not going to Nineveh. So I didn't know from the beginning, but I knew God was calling me and I knew that I was supposed to say yes. I knew it was special, but not a lead pastor. No.
And when was it that because you were 15 when you had that encounter pretty much where you knew you wanted to serve God, but at what age were you, or how did you go into the lead or pastorship? And I ask this because there's so many young women or women who feel something, but they don't know where is it that moment you just knew that you couldn't run anymore. And now it was like, okay, this is it where I totally know that this is what God wants for me.
God called me to be a lead pastor. I believe that at that point I was ready. And so I never ran from the position of being a lead pastor, but God never called me to be a lead pastor when he first called me. Like, all I knew is that when God said, go get ready for ministry. And so life is all about story, right? And so, and it's our saying yes to God in the process, and no. And with every yes comes a no. And so for me, at the age of 16, I was dating a young man who I we thought at some point we would marry. I'm single, so obviously I didn't marry the guy. Um, and he was a good guy. As a matter of fact, he was called. He was called to ministry as well, and he was a couple of years older than I. And so he was already serving in ministry. And when God called me, it felt very clear that I needed to go and prepare myself um, for ministry. And so my boyfriend at that time didn't want that. And that was very difficult. But I prayed and I said, God, if this is not from you and I am not supposed to go, then you tell me. Because my boyfriend said God had told him about me. And I wasn't certain. And so I prayed and I asked God. And every time I spoke with God, he continued to say, you go prepare yourself. And so I remember the day sitting at a restaurant, taking off what was called a promise ring at that point. Not an engagement, but a promise ring. So obviously at Taylor, we had already spoken about quite a few things. And Miriam, culturally, we start getting pretty serious pretty young when it comes to marriage, right? You're like marrying at 18, 19. And so that was probably going to be my story at that point in my life. And I remember sitting at that restaurant, taking off the promise ring, crying, and giving it to him and saying, I'm choosing to be obedient to God and go and prepare myself for ministry. And today he is a wonderful man of God. Like, he really is. He's a great man of God. And God has actually chosen, and I have chosen, because I think it's been a partnership between the both of us, to stay single. And so in this process, I was ready and I knew to do that. Like, I made some significant decisions in my life, like life altering decisions at that moment, where my parents, I remember being in the room with my parents and they're saying, are you sure, Mija, this is what you want? And they supported it. And so every step of the way, it was God knowing where I was at and what I was capable of, what would it turn me off. And so I said yes. And that's when I went to Bethany College to get my church leadership degree. And then from there, I became an associate pastor in LA. And so I wasn't a lead pastor yet. I was only an associate pastor. And I was there as an associate pastor for about 5 years. And there are incredible stories in that season of my life. And then I went and I became an associate pastor again for 5 years in Ventura. And then it was there at that church where I felt God was calling me to church plant. And it was through a process of just knowing that this was the time God had prepared me, like, for such a time as this, with an Esther kind of experience. And I said yes. But it was over years of, God just teaching. I wasn't ready. I don't think I would have even known what it meant to say yes to be a lead pastor at that point. But I knew how to say yes to just a call, if that makes sense.
Definite, it does. Yeah. And that's what's so, it's just like, that's what we need to know. And really, and thank you for clarifying that today, that it's just following that call that we feel inside. Not, we don't have to know ABC when it comes to God. That's why we walk a walk of faith. It's all in faith. And we just give ourselves to God. So we surrender one day at a time, 1 year at a time. And God just begins to walk us out to where he wants us to be. And that is because that is so satisfying in your life. Like you're saying, to make that point there, like you just touched a little point where you said, as Hispanics, for us, it's just like 21, you're married. or you already had your first child by that age. So 16 is something very serious. And that was something that you closed the door to at that time, to follow God. And it was that call of God who has led you to and placed you where you're at today. And I am a true believer that when we do that, God just he just surprises us with so many beautiful things that today, I mean, who would have thought that yes would bring you all the way to this? And then again, our story has been being written every day. So so who knows what's coming ahead, Adelita?
Ooh, who knows? Hey, I'm only halfway. I got 50 more years to go. Come on, let's do this, guys.
Well, I want to ask you another question, because you kind of touched a little bit about it, but it all begins with I believe it all begins in our home. And I want you to share a little bit about the legacy of where you're coming from, your home, how your parents influenced, because you mentioned your parents too there, how it was so important for them to come aboard with you on what you're doing today, and also other people who have influenced your journey through where you're at today.
Wow, so many great questions. So my parents, I think what would need to be known about them, just to kind of see how, God was gracious, very gracious to me. I'm one of 13 children. And so I am number 10 of 13. So that tells you I got a lot of story with my family. But my parents both have very radical kind of Pauline type of conversions, just radical. My dad was a destructive gambler when he married my mom. My mom came from a home of alcoholism, but she was a very devout Catholic. And so when my parents married at about 5 years, they were ready for a divorce. But my dad was invited to an Assemblies of God church, and my dad went, and his first experience at a church was radical. My father returned home. My dad never gambled again. And so my mother, check this out. My mom, when she tells the story, she makes us laugh all the time, because she says that when my dad, from that point on, he would get ready. He would shower. He'd put cologne on. He'd put nice clothes on, and he would head out every day. And he would tell her, "I'm going to church." My mother said, "I never believed him. How he never got ready like that. I thought he's going to see other women." And so one day, my mother chose to follow my father, and she went and followed him to church. And first day at church, my mom had her own radical conversion. So that was after 5 kids. So I come in the picture as kid 10, and my parents are now leaders in the church. They love Jesus. Their lives have been changed. And so I get to grow up, right, in this Christian home. And that was the grace of God for me. And so I was really grateful for my parents. My parents, if I were to describe my parents, I describe them, I describe my father as this, he's a walking Bible. My father has the Bible memorized like nobody's business. Like I'm afraid to sit with my father and talk about the Bible, because he's like, and what about this? And he'll quote, and I'm like, well, let me grab the Bible, Dad. I don't memorize like you. But my dad is a walking Bible. He is someone to highly, that's what I always remember about him. He was always in the Word, and he was a great leader in the church. And my mom, on the opposite end, she was just this amazing intercessor. She had this amazing way about her where she prayed morning, noon, and night. My home was filled with her singing all of the time, waking up at 2 a.m, and she was on her knees. And so for me, my parents were a huge, huge model as godly. Now, that does not mean that their children, didn't cause them a lot of headaches, because thank God for Jesus and his grace, because they have stories they can tell about the headaches and the troubles that their kids got into. But they were a huge part of my life. And so even the story that I shared at the beginning, I vividly remember being in my room crying after that decision that I made, and both of them there supporting me and saying, okay, are you sure this is what you wanted? And I was the first girl to ever leave the state of Washington. I grew up in the state of Washington, so I went to California. And so we didn't have a lot of money, and so we didn't leave. And so for me to leave Washington to California, that was tough on my parents. Like we were sheltered. We didn't go many places. And so for them to support me to leave this state, to go and become a minister, I know that was hard for them, but they supported it. So they were huge.
I love that. I love that you have such a dynamic story, and you've talked about so many different aspects of it so far. Like, this has just been such a good conversation. But you're not only a lead pastor, right? We've kind of highlighted that, but you're also a multiple church planter. You are a writer. You're a national level leader. You've spoken on stages big and small, and you're doing an amazing job of leading. And I think that at some point, somebody's going to listen to this conversation and they're going to point to you and say, she influenced me just from what I've heard on this podcast. But all stories have points of conflict or tension or areas that just aren't always as polished as we would want to present to the world. So what are some obstacles that you've had to overcome to be faithful to your call? You have mentioned a couple of times being timid, and I don't believe that.
I can start there, actually.
Yeah. What are some things that you've just had to overcome in your life throughout your story to really be faithful to this call?
Yeah. That's a great question. So that was probably my greatest obstacle as I began saying yes to God. Is I didn't know at that time what I know now, and that is that most lead pastors have certain personality types, and I'm not one of them. And so, if we, kind of refer to like a disc personality, type, you have like, the dominant or the dominant personality, and then you have that inspirational personality. You have the steady fast, and then you have the conscientiousness personality. And so they're all very different. And biblically speaking, there are biblical leaders with every single one of those personalities. But in most circles that I'm around, most lead pastors have the dominance, the D, and the I. The influence is really, it's I's influence. And I'm not. I'm the steadfastness personality. And so I realized that. So what did I need to overcome? Number one, I think God was so great when he said, don't want to be like anybody else. It's who I've called you to be. I lived so many years of my lives, ladies, wanting to be like somebody else. Even with that beginning marker of God in my life, it was still something that you had to live through. Like, you had to become broken before God. I had to learn to love myself. Like, I love who I am. I love who God made me. And loving me, I was able to work through a lot of my own weaknesses. And so today, people, when I share my story and tell them what my natural personality is, they say I'm lying. They say that I was repressed and that it really wasn't me, because how could I possibly, right, get in front of, those thousands of people, be on a stage, right? But in reality, that really is the work of God. I tell these people, I say, I know what my natural personality is. I know I'm an introvert naturally. I know I need to go home and recover, and people deplete me. I love people, but people deplete me. Like, I know who I am today. Like, I need to go home and recover. This is who I am. But I had to learn that stuff. Those were obstacles for me in ministry. Like, really, really facing like the truth of who I am, and it's okay. And learning not to compare, learning not to be jealous, learning to cooperate, learning how to build a team that is reflective of all these personalities, and you don't have to be jealous of any of them either. Like, you can be you and be the lead pastor here. And so all of those things have been processes of learning, becoming aware of who I am. I think sometimes we're not even aware of our weaknesses, and so we don't grow in them. So that has been a huge obstacle. I have been my own obstacle. So yes, I would say that over time, I think I was young was an obstacle. I became a licensed minister when I was 21 years old, and so at that age, yeah, and so I think just getting over the fact that you're young, and people seeing you young and having to fight through that. I've learned over this, and if I was telling a young minister who was listening, or someone who wants to go into ministry and says, I'm too young, I would say, just remember, learning is a process. You're supposed to be young. You're supposed to be unexperienced, right? This is part of it. It's okay. And so even now, like today, a lesson learned is you're always learning. You're always growing. I just have learned a little more now because I'm 50, but there's still people who know more than I do. And so you always have to deal with that. Like, there's always somebody who knows more than you. But when you're young, I think it's just harder. And so getting over the fact that I was young, I think some of my taboos was that I was young, that I was a female. I mean, that was obviously, you wouldn't think that your gender is an obstacle, but in reality, culturally and theologically, it is an obstacle for many people. And so, I had a couple of times in ministry when I was, I love my fellow men. I do. I think that God created us to work together. But I had some fellow brothers who tried to kick me out of a pastorship. As much as you have a covering, that hurts. It stings. You want to fight back. You want to beat somebody up. And those are the times where God is teaching you, you honor, you respect, you don't hit back, you go the extra mile. And all of that struggle inside of you, like when people are coming against your femininity and that you can't, man, that's the breaking point of God in your heart, because you can become super resentful and you can hate. And so those are just things God is working out in you. You did nothing to deserve this. Like, I don't think I did anything just because I'm a woman, right? Just because I'm a female. And I had another taboo that some don't. I'm single, And so the fact that I'm single and I'm female and I was young and I'm Latina, you could tell those are great things. Like, they're great, beautiful things. They describe who I am. But those very same things have been obstacles, like obstacles for me as a single woman. Really, can you be a lead pastor as a single woman? Can you truly counsel couples? Can you counsel families? You're not married, you don't have children, and lead pastors, they have to do that. And so God's work within me, and me coming to a place where I was absolutely certain that the greatest counsel is not experience. The greatest counsel is the word of God. That's the greatest counsel that you could possibly have. And so anything that has to do with marriage, anything that has to do with parenting, not anything, most things are relational. And if I'm a relational being, then I can help people. And so all of those things have to do with relationship. And so God, like, working that in your own heart and saying, yes, you can. Like, there's one thing in marriage that I say I do not counsel, and that's sexual intimacy, because that has not been a place that I have been. So I send out, and we've got great people in the church who can do that. But outside of that, it's relational. Like, you can, the word of God teaches you how to counsel, right? And you have relationships with parents and relationships with friends and relationships with leaders, and all of those factors, right, of communication and personality, all that stuff, they all play into it. And so getting to a point where I knew that, like, I didn't know that at the beginning. I was just like frustrating. So it's the constant learning and knowing, what, God isn't limited to a woman, or that you're single, or that you're young, or that you're Latina, or you're or you're white, or you're African American, you're Asian, whatever it may be, that doesn't limit God. And so they were huge obstacles for me, Nikki. They were huge. And just working through them. And that's one of the reasons why I like to mentor young ladies. Like this morning before this call, that's, I had a call with another young minister lady, because she's a woman and she's single. Like, I get you.
That's amazing, Adelita. You're just like boom, 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 giving. You just ran right into my next question. If you could go back and tell your younger self, one advice to help you not to take life so seriously, or the ministry so seriously the way you did, because we do take it seriously, but to the point where sometimes we feel inadequate. What would it be?
I think one, and just even hearing about just hearing the story of my life, and I think it's the story of all of our lives. Is just the stories, look different. The detail is different. But it is the reminder to stay confident in your call. Like, just stay confident. Doesn't matter what people tell you. Know that God calls, and I'm going to say this again because I believe it firmly, God has called both men and women to rule together. Genesis 1, right? And to know the why, what you know. Like, don't just say it in your head, somebody told me. No, the word of God told me. God told me. Like, I know this through scripture. Like, I'm called as a female. I'm called as single. I'm called as, whatever ethnicity. I'm called. Like, there's nothing that takes that away. All he said was male and female. He called to rule together. And he didn't give a descriptor what a male need to look like or what a female need to look like. If you're just male, if you're just female, right? You're here to rule together. And so just to be confident in that, and to know why you're confident in that, because people are always going to come. I still have people come to church today, and one of the first things they do is say, "You're the lead pastor?" And then the next question is, "Where's your husband?" Right? Those are really common questions I still get today, and I've been pastoring, right, this church for more than 10 years. And so, but because it's still not something that is widely accepted or widely experienced, and so I need to know, like, every day, and so being confident. I think just be confident in your call. I'm going to change that. Maybe not even be confident, stay confident. Because there's got to be a moment. If you said yes, you're confident, but I think we lose it. And so it's the stay confident. Like, it's the understanding that I can go back to, like, I can regress to think that I don't because of what others might say. And so stay confident in your call. I would tell my young person, don't go back and forth so much. Like, stay confident and maybe learn these things, early on in life, and, not later in life. I would probably tell my younger self, find yourself a female, and be really open and honest with that person. I can be very transparent. I don't have a problem with transparency. I used to have a problem with transparency. I don't have a problem with transparency anymore, because it's what sets us free. The truth sets you free, and I'd rather be free. And so I struggled, I struggled with that a lot, sharing my stuff. Like, I was too much of a private person. Me and God, we could share everything, and God was going to accept me and be good. But me with somebody else, I didn't know if that person would still like me, and I wanted to be liked. And so I would probably say, find somebody sooner than later, and truly just, obviously it has to be somebody who's mature, somebody you can trust, but just begin to be honest sooner than later. Because I think there's things we can learn that we don't need to necessarily experience. Maybe you need to experience it once or twice, but not 10 times. I've learned that faithfulness is more important than fruitfulness. There are seasons where we are pruned and we are being broken, and there is no fruit to see. And in order to become a mature woman in ministry or man in ministry. We need brokenness, and brokenness is only found in when you're going through difficult circumstances, in that pruning, in that barrenness. And so I would just say to my younger self, don't get disappointed when there's no fruit. There's something to celebrate about that. Stay faithful. God's doing a work that you are so unaware of, but it's going to be good. And I think if I would have known that as a younger self, because again, when you're comparing yourself and you're seeing people, they're in a different season than you are, right? They're in the fruit season and you're in the barrenness season or the pruning season. And we tend to compare at that time and say, don't do that. This is a needed season for your life. And so that would probably have removed a lot of unnecessary pain. I mean, the pain was going to be there because that's what the barren season is about. But there was a lot of unnecessary pain.
That is so good. Adelita, it has been such a joy to be able to just sit here and hear your story. And like Miriam said, there were just so many nuggets. It was just like boom, 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 boom. So thank you for your vulnerability, your transparency, your honest truth today. I think that, like I said, it's going to be so valuable because there are women out there who feel like they're too timid. They feel like they can't do it because of who they were born as and what their upbringing was, or many of the obstacles that have been placed before them. And yet they can look to somebody like an Adelita Garza, who has shown that it's possible to overcome physical things, emotional things, society's definition of who you should be. Just, you have done all of these things to be obedient to God's calling on your life, and yet you do it and you make it look so easy and you do it so well. And so just by modeling this, it's going to do so much for those young women who are wondering, where do I fit in this? I feel like God's calling me into ministry, but I just don't know if I look the part, if I act the part, if I can really do this. So thank you for that, because it's just so valuable. And we're just honored that you were able to jump on here today and have this conversation with us. And thank you, Miriam, for inviting Adelita and just for kind of coming up, shaping this as an opportunity to just share with young women all over our SoCal network with what it really truly looks like to be a leader, the ups and the downs. So thank you so much. And friends, we have certainly enjoyed having this conversation, and we hope that you have enjoyed hearing this and being a part of this. So be sure to follow us on social media at Women of SoCal AG, and share this episode with a friend, because you have been listening to this and you've been thinking of someone who needs to hear some of these nuggets of wisdom from Adelita. So share this episode with a friend, and we'll see you next time.